Hello and welcome back to my office. This is a rather late January Scavengers talk. My apologies for that, but you'll see from the Pilgrims, Vintners and Templars that I've been pretty madly busy in the last month. Not just Christmas, it's also things like trying to finish up books, which still isn't finished. I've got one more week to do it in. I'm hoping it will all come well in the next week. Basically, I've decided I've got to delete 7 or 8 scenes, rewrite them, and then put in a whole new ending. But these are the things that happen to authors, sadly. Now, Omar Alexander asked me several questions, and I'm going to zip through them. So first was, he wanted to know what books and resources I'd found helpful in my research about Shanghai. Now, there's one book in particular that should be on my desk but doesn't seem to be. Where is it? Ah, there it is. I have mentioned this book already before, but it's Robert Vickers and Empire Made Me. This is a brilliant book. It's the biography of a guy who went out, he was in the First World War in the trenches, had not a bad war. He saw an awful lot of death, obviously, on the front line. He was in danger quite a bit, but he's one of those people who seemed to thrive on it. When he came back to England, he just couldn't cope with the peace and decided he was going to go out to Shanghai and become a policeman there. A lot of people, Shanghai did depend on recruits from the British Army after the First World War. They lost a lot of their policemen during the war because a lot of them did volunteer and join up to go into the army, and obviously quite a few of them never went back. But this is much more than just a biography of a guy who went out there. It's the story of Shanghai itself. And it's a really fascinating look at every aspect of life. It describes the whole of the city. It describes how people related to each other. It describes the Chinese experience, the problems with the Japanese invasion, and then the death of this poor fellow. Basically, he was a policeman, but he didn't have a particularly good war. His name's Maurice Tinkler, by the way. Bit of a sad name. That's him there on the cover. Maurice Tinkler succumbed to alcohol, as happens so often. He was a fairly obvious racist, as probably quite a few of the police were. And he was one of the first Europeans to be murdered by the Japanese forces because he tried to protect some of his Chinese employees from being taken away, I think it was. And he was murdered by the Japanese. So it's not an entirely happy story, but it is a fascinating story, and it's really well written. It reads like a thriller. On a similar vein, because I was finding out about Shanghai Police, this was very useful too. It's called Shanghai Policeman by E.W. Peters. Now, Peters was a particularly nasty piece of work, I think it's fair to say. He had to leave the Shanghai Police because he beat a Chinese peasant to death. That's not nice, is it? However, he also married a Chinese girl, I think it was himself, and brought her back to England and lived a not particularly happy life back in England. Once he came back, I assume he would have been shunned by a lot of his neighbours and so on. But this is a really good story in terms of giving you a feel for how the Shanghai police force worked. There's more. Then again, the Shanghai Green Gang is very good. The guy who wrote the book on Maurice Tinkler, Professor Vickers, was extremely helpful when I asked him for advice on different books, and he recommended this by Brian G. Martin, The Shanghai Green Gang. It's subtitled Politics and Organised Crime 1919 to 1937. And this is absolute essential reading for anybody who wants to get on with Shanghai. It explains how the different gangs were set up, what sort of activities they were involved in, absolutely everything to do with Shanghai. Another book I rather liked, Old Shanghai, Gangsters in Paradise by Lin Pan. This goes through the different gang leaders, Du Yusheng and the other guys, and explains how they infiltrated the police, how they got involved in smuggling, all different types of illegal gang warfare. Shanghai at the time was notable because it was about the only place in the world that was a lot more dangerous than Al Capone's Chicago. And in fact, the Chicago police did send officers over to train with the Shanghai police. And they tended to go back early because they didn't like how dangerous it was. The Shanghai police were a special group. And talking about that, I come to some of the obvious books. The World's First SWAT Team. This is by Leroy Thompson, who's done a number of books on urban warfare and policing and various things. But this is basically the story of the Shanghai police, and in particular how it was formed by W.E. Fairburn. Now, Fairburn was one of the two characters, Fairburn and Sykes, who set up a lot of the policing methods that they had in Shanghai. And when I say policing methods, I mean, for example, they developed bulletproof vests for their officers so that when they were storming a building, it was quite likely that they'd be shot at and they hopefully would be safe. He developed, in effect, practical pistol shooting, which is now an international, rather wonderful competitive sport. But at the time it was purely and simply to teach police officers how to draw a gun fast, how to aim at a target without necessarily looking at the sights, and fire 2-3 shots very, very quickly, and then how to survive a gun battle. They were so successful, Fairbairn and Sykes, that at the outbreak of the Second World War, they were brought back to England, and they were involved in, first of all, developing the commando knife, the Fairbairn Sykes first model, which was then issued to all the commandos. It was a special metal dagger made by Wilkinson Sword, I think, originally. They developed that, and they developed their own techniques for knife fighting in the streets of Shanghai. They also then started training the commandos in all kinds of offence and defence, hand-to-hand combat, dagger combat to kill people, and so on. One of the interesting things is that I remember listening to an interview when The Lord of the Rings first came out, and the interviewer was talking to one of the actors, I forget which it was, but he said that the great actor who played Saruman, whose name escapes me right now, but it will come back to me, he also did Dracula and various other things, but when they were talking about him being killed by the little Weasley fellow, originally they wanted him to give a great loud cry, and Saruman, I'm just finding out what his name is, Christopher Lee said, oh no, he wouldn't make a loud sound like that. If he was stabbed in the back in that way, he'd give a little sigh, and that would be it. And when they asked him, all he would say was he had been in the commandos in the Second World War. He was a very interesting chap, Christopher Lee, but he was trained by Fairbairn. So what other books? Well, talking about Mr. Fairbairn, Shooting to Live was one of his books with Mr. Sykes, and Scientific Self-Defense was also written by Fairburn. Interesting, this has a preface by Douglas Fairbanks, not the junior, Douglas Fairbanks himself, who was a fighting man himself. And he was a visitor to Shanghai. He met Fairburn and did appreciate having some training with Fairburn. Those two are really interesting, more because they're historical records of how people used to be taught how to fight. But the Scientific Self-Defense is the system that Fairburn used to train the commandos. Another book that was very useful was Policing Shanghai, 1927 to 37. It's only the early part of this that was particularly useful, but very handy as a bit of additional background. Now, I'm not going to go through too many other things, but there's 3 more books I have to mention. One is Underworld of the East by James Lee. Now, this is a bit of an odd book because it was written by an absolutely committed drug taker, in the 1800s. He was one of those rare things, a completely non-racist imperial chap. He was an engineer, a steam engineer by training, and worked in various mines maintaining and mending machines. But this is basically a history of a drug user's life. And it's very interesting because he goes through a principle that he says served him well. He says that he was, while in Asia, he always took drugs. It might be cocaine, it might be heroin, it might be any one of a number of other drugs. But he took them in combination, and he could tell when his body was going a little bit the wrong way with one drug, and then he would reduce that drug and up the other drug. And in that way, he found he never had a permanent addiction. And he said that when he came back to England, he just gave up taking all the drugs because there was no need for it. And he knew it wouldn't help him finding jobs and so on, so he just stopped taking them. But completely non-racist. He talks about his life in Asia, times in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, in the jungle, in Borneo, all over the place. Fascinating character and a really very interesting book. Another book for local flavour was this, Bund, or Bunt. The Bunt by Peter Hibbard. Now, Peter Hibbard is, I think, a bit of a tourist leader for people who visit Shanghai. This book's great because it's got lots of photos. It's absolutely full of pictures of old Shanghai and Shanghai as it is now. But one thing that I really like is it's got a map of the Bund, and it tells you, numbered, where each of the main buildings was. And each of those buildings he talks about in some detail in this, so you get a feel for which buildings were there and when, and what the atmosphere of the place was like. And then one last book I have to mention because this one was enormously useful. But I'm writing about people who were shattered by the First World War. So Taylor Downing, Breakdown, subtitled The Crisis of Shell Shock on the Somme, 1916. Found this really, really useful because it tells you about how it was discovered, how it was treated, the opinion of doctors for the troops, the attitude of the people afterwards, and so on. I also used quite a bit of commentary from one of Dorothy L. Sayers' books. I think it was The Murder at the Bologna Club. And that one had one of the suspects was somebody who'd been in the First World War and was suffering badly from shell shock. And the attitude of the other people seeing this fellow suffering, I thought was very interesting, and that did colour a fair bit of my writing. Having said all this, Shanghai hasn't found a home yet. I'm hoping it will, but there's, as always with publishing, absolutely no guarantee. So it may well be that all this research and hard effort comes to nothing, which is sod's law, if you pardon the English It's one of those things. Not every book does make it into print. However, if it doesn't make it into print, I think it's very likely that I'll stick it on the internet, because I like the story, I really like the atmosphere, the period and everything else. And if I can make a few bob out of flogging some copies on Amazon Kindle or wherever, then that's got to be worthwhile. So that was that for the very first question. Hope that was okay. Omar, if you've got further questions, and also, of course, all you other scavengers out there, if you've got any questions, do please let me know. I'd be delighted to answer them. And it gives me a reason for turning on the camera again, after all. Thanks a lot for watching. Hope that was interesting, and I'll speak to you again soon. Cheers.